We have three speakers coming up next. They will be speaking together and taking turns as they work their way through their presentation. The first one is one of my colleagues here, and that's Dr. Laurie Foreman. She's both a professor and our development advisor here at APCSS. Laurie joined the center back in 2011. She's an expert on international economic development and foreign aid, civil society, and public-private partnerships. She earned her PhD from the Faculty of Law at Keio University and a Master in Public Policy from Harvard. Prior to joining APCSS, Laurie held senior corporate positions with Microsoft and Dubai Holding. In government, she held positions including the U.S. Alternate Executive Director on the Board of Directors of the Asian Development Bank and Assistant Administrator for Asia and Near East Asia for USAID. She also served in the NGO sector for 11 years, and then in her postgraduate career in Washington, D.C., she served as the senior political analyst for the White House pollster. Okay. Our next presenter is going to be Dr. Tim Burer. Tim is also a professor here at APCSS. He joined us last year. He has over 30 years of experience as an economist and a lawyer advising governments and other organizations in Southeast Asia, Micronesia, Africa, the Middle East, and the United States. Over his career, Dr. Buehrer has organized and taught in well over 100 training events for government officials and supported efforts of the U.S. Department of State and USAID with stronger linkages between the U.S. and the countries where he was working to promote stronger linkages. And finally, our third presenter, who will make up our trio today, is another faculty member here at APCSS, and is Dr. Srini Sitaraman. Srini joined the APCSS in 2019, where his focus is on Indo-Pacific security, with a particular focus on South Asia, regional conflict, and India-China relations. Srini holds a master's degree in international affairs from Ohio University and received his doctorate in political science and international relations from the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. Prior to arriving at APCSS, Srini was a tenured associate professor in the Department of Political Science at Clark University in Massachusetts. He was also a core member of the faculty for the Asian Studies program, adjunct faculty in the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Clark, and also an associate in research at the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard. So without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to turn the floor over to our three faculty members here at APCSS for their presentation on gray zone economics. And I see that they are already up on the screen. I see, and over to you. Thank you.
So thank you, Lumpy, very much, and aloha. This is Laurie. I'm here with Tim and Srini, and not only is economics so incredibly important, but so is flexibility. We were three of the people who got bumped off of government Zoom, so we quickly scrambled to all be together here working off of one rotating microphone, so I hope you can all hear us well, and we'll do our best with these new conditions. So as Lindy mentioned, we're going to talk today about influencing populations and affecting legitimacy through economic means. And that has been brought up multiple times in this workshop so far, which is fantastic. We're going to look at it a little deeper now, and we're going to go with a basic premise, which is that this can be both a positive and a negative. We're going to look how you can use different means to both interfere with or promote economic growth. It is two sides of the same coin, and some of the same tools can be used both in a positive and a negative way. So I'm thinking about how we were going to organize this because it's such a huge topic. What we decided to do was, okay, if you're going to interfere with economic growth, what are the four factors of production that contribute to economic growth? And those fall into the categories of land, labor, capital, and enterprise. So what we're going to do is we're going to take 7 or 8 minutes to speak to each of those four categories. And we're going to take a little break after each one to answer a couple of questions, immediate questions on that particular category. And then we'll save a big chunk of time at the end for a broader discussion and more questions from all of you. And we're looking forward very much to that conversation. So with that, we're going to start off first with the aspect of land. And with that, I turn it over to Srini.
Aloha, everyone. So I want to start off talking about a little bit about the dependence that gray zone situations create in economic category. If you look at the current COVID crisis, global crisis, pandemic crisis, the United States, for instance, imported or imports 48% of the PPE masks from the People's Republic of China. It got roughly about 40% of the medical devices, particularly some of the ventilators, from China. And the APIs, 13% of global facilities. So what you're looking at is a situation there, potentially an adversary could put pressure on these kind of supply chains and reduce the ability of a particular state to effectively respond to a pandemic. And this could be another instance where you could put pressure on an adversary just below the threshold of a major conflict. And it's difficult for a country to switch supply chains in the middle of a major pandemic.
What's API?
API could be all kind of associated professional medical devices and things like that. And those are made across the world.
Okay. That was a question on the chat.
Tim, next slide.
This is not, oh, just a second. There we go.
So the second issue that I wanted to highlight here is the vaccines, right? So the vaccine vials that you see is one of the manufacturing inputs for them are sand. For sand is limited in
Next slide.
is limited in quality and quantity. So that could be another area. So if you're sourcing all your sand from one or two countries, there could be a supply chain bottleneck, or a country could deliberately limit the amount of sand you're going to get because it is making its own vaccine and they are drawing all the necessary sand for making those vials for themselves. So these are sort of a recurrent problems that could, just looking at sand, the construction industry alone, uses up to 50 billion tons of this global shortage. People have been talking about lack of sand and glass vials since 2015. So looking forward and looking ahead, countries should think critically about diversifying the supply chains so they reduce the vulnerabilities to gray zone tactics being applied in the economic sphere.
Well, thank you very much there, Srini, and let me just talk a little bit more about supply chains. I'm here not to talk about as much gray zones as to why we do this sort of thing, and how the use of supply chains like this is sort of a critical part of the way in which we've organized. And as the speaker on Monday said, we need to be thinking about this as we're designing, as Srini just mentioned. So I just have two examples here that I'm just going to talk about very, very briefly. One is sort of how Apple does this, where they source from all over the world. They wind up sending all the bits to China to be manufactured, and then they ship them from there to all over the world. This creates a bottleneck and a potential problem. You can address the problem, but you can't address the fact that the parts are coming from everywhere. And so if South Korea wanted to stop certain kinds of chips from flowing, there'd be a problem for that supply chain too. But we can't make everything all at home. And so somehow we have to figure out in our diversification efforts how this works. And the other part and Apple is, I think, an example of where you're doing these supply chains to lower price. For Boeing, which is this other photo here, has these very broad and very wide supply chains because they're trying to create markets. They're trying to create markets for the plane by bringing in companies from all over the world as part of that process. But we're not just talking, when we talk about supply chains, it's not just supply chains. There's other examples of commodity restrictions. And just very briefly, we've seen in the past that China controls much of the rare earth supply. And they have used that in the past as a club against Japan. And there were some concerns as to whether it would be used against the United States. OPEC back in the 70s and 80s used their control over oil. And De Beers, well, everybody knows what De Beers does with diamonds. And those are ways in which, you know, commodity restrictions also play out in this. And with that, I think we're now to Q&A.
Does land imply laws govern property to include real estate? Land in the construct of land, labor, capital, enterprise. You know, so is that all we're talking about?
So in the economic construct of the factors of production, land refers to all resources. It refers to any sort of natural, primarily natural resources that you have available to contribute to the equation of economic growth. So it's not just the physical land, the ground that we're standing on, but it can be, fisheries, or it can be, crops, it can be technology, whatever. It's your resources that you have to contribute to economic growth. So what our point is that interfering with access to any of those resources can therefore impede economic growth, and can therefore be one of those factors that influences a population or affects legitimacy, and also being able to reward people as a positive by giving them preferential access to resources that they need that you have can also be another way that these economic tools can be used in a sort of gray zone matter. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think so. And some more questions have started to come in. We might not get to all of them now, ladies and gentlemen, but if we don't, we'll get to them more towards the end for sure. Regarding, this is more specific to the topic of gray zones, but do you have any examples or thoughts, any of the three of you, on how the global supply chain is used coercively?
So let me go back to the question that was posed previously. So APIs, right? The active pharmaceutical ingredients, that's what it stands for. So if you look at the APIs, nearly 80% of the APIs now are sourced from PRC. The top 5 countries are Ireland, China, Singapore, France, Argentina, and then several other countries. So what happens in these kind of APIs is that you could have a country say a situation that we need it for ourselves, right? If you look at APIs are basically active biological ingredients, not just raw materials. You see that in other areas. You see that in one of the examples that Tim gave on rare earths. The rare earths are critical in making cell phones, computers, supercomputers, chips, all kinds of electronic ingredients. You see that similarly if you look at the vaccine now, a lot of countries are not sharing some of the critical ingredients necessary. If you look at vaccine exports, the only country that is actively exporting vaccines now is India.
So just to the general question, I think the fundamental issue on supply chains is how much do you trust your partners? Because anytime you're in a supply chain, and if you haven't diversified the supply chain extensively, you're at risk. And so fundamentally, as we think about supply chains, and companies do this all the time, you think about how well diversified are you and how you do this. So that's it. That's our response to that question.
Okay. That sounds good. We've got a lot more questions flowing in, but we're going to stick to and keep rolling on. So back over to you. Thank you.
Okay, so the next category we're going to talk about a little bit is the category of labor. And in this section, I want to talk specifically about the issue of labor supply and the labor migration, which is a massive category, particularly in the Indo-Pacific region. And there are literally millions of people that are on the move each year for jobs outside of the country of their birth. And so you can see pretty easily how denying either access to this labor to fill your labor gaps, or by denying entry of these laborers so that they cannot gain these incomes can have a huge impact. And let me see if I can advance the slides here. So just to give you a sense of how influential this can be, in the Indo-Pacific region, there are 14 economies that report the value of remittances, the money that is sent back home by laborers overseas. The value of remittances is 5% of their GDP or higher. And this is official figures. These are clearly underestimated because a lot of remittances are sent back home through unofficial channels. But even at this rate, you're looking at that this many countries that are affected significantly by these remittances. And the top 5 on this list, they're in double digits. So you can imagine if borders were closed, for some geopolitical reason, or, heaven forbid, a pandemic, and these laborers could not be overseas and could not be sending these remittances home, that this would have a very dramatic impact on the revenues in the gross domestic product of the home countries, and therefore could definitely affect, stability and legitimacy as well. So, and the other question then is like, well, okay, you've got these people going overseas. You've also got this question of demographics globally driving some movements of labor migrants. So, for instance, looking at today and now looking 30 years from now, China's going to end up with 175 million fewer people of the working age population than they have today. I mean, that's this subtract from today's number. And China's not alone like that. Japan's going down, Korea, even Thailand's going down. And you have to look at like, where is that labor going to come from? Well, it's not going to come from Europe, because Europe as a whole is going to decline as well between now and 2030. Now, it could come from other parts of Southeast Asia, definitely South Asia. It could come from Oceania. The big one, it could come from sub-Saharan Africa. Large numbers there, and just to round out the map of what the other ones in here. But you can see, if labor supply is needed, there are going to be different players who have the labor supply that they could provide that have an influence and could significantly influence the the conditions and the legitimacy of these countries, of these governments. I'm going to make one other point before I hand it over to Srini. And this is one that relates somewhat to the disinformation as in this discussion. The phenomenon that's happening right now is that there's an increased demand for labor migration. There's an increased demand for migrants, just for those demographic reasons alone. But at the same time, there's an increased demand that's being met with increasing resistance to migration. Public opinion polls, public statements in countries around the world are showing people that are resistant to having the migrants come in, even to do the necessary work, and a lot of this is related to incorrect information, overstating the negatives about migrants, underestimating the positives, and that is all very susceptible to disinformation campaigns that could cause, again, some instability in these countries, both the sending and the receiving countries. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Srini for a few comments.
Just wrong one. Operator left.
The right one. There you go.
All right. So let me give you a different example here. This was a few years back, again, drawing from some of the current political stuff. So there's a region on the northeast part of India, which is called Arunachal Pradesh. The region pretty much is under control of India. It's incorporated as a state. Elections are held and all the good stuff. So there are a lot of athletes who are going to participate in a sporting event in China. So what happened was that the athletes were not given proper visas. What they did was China said, oh, we don't recognize that particular area as being a part of India. So we are going to issue a paper visa, which is stapled onto their passport. So this is stapled visas. So as you can see from the slide, and the Indian government said, look, no, you can't do that because that is not a proper way to issue a visa. And they issued an advisory saying, please don't travel on the visas. If you did, you might not be able to enter a country or re-enter a country that may not be. So what essentially happened was that the athletes who were involved couldn't travel. It was some kind of archery competition, and there were other competitions subsequently. And later there were other delegations from India were also similarly impacted. This is an example of gray zone tactic. This is one other way that one country expresses its displeasure towards another country or something else over a political issue, a diplomatic issue, or a territorial conflict where it went ahead and it said, hey, look, we don't really like what you're doing in this area, so we're going to punish you in this area. And it's so subtle. So if you're not, for an average person who's not into this particular politics of this region, you won't know what the connections are made. The people making the decision will clearly know why the country acted. Let me show you another example. If you look at the map there, the map on the left-hand side is the People's Republic of China, as we generally understand, right? The map on the right-hand side is the way the new map is being drawn. So many countries are opposed to having a country represent itself in a geographic way, in a way that China's done. But just to give you another example. Okay. Just to give you another example here, on the same topic, there's an authority in China, which is just Geological Survey, and they approve all the maps. And they say, well, this is according to us, this is the worldview. But other countries in the region are saying, hey, this is not the way we look at the world. There are other ways of depicting the world. So this is another subtle way of expressing displeasure, another subtle way of showing how your country presents itself to the public world, how the regional partners react to it.
And that's the end of this of the labor section. So over to you,
Okay.
Lucky, for any questions.
Yeah, sounds good. And just a minor admin note to the ladies and gentlemen in the audience, thanks again. And as you know, I mentioned earlier, government Zoom got, there were some technical issues and got shut down earlier today, not too long ago. And so the three faculty that you see there, really, they scrambled to an alternate location, not their originally intended setup for this presentation. So honestly, I'm just grateful that they're here and that we can see them and hear them and look at their slides today, even though the audio might be a little bit low. Hopefully you can turn up your volume and listen to them. So thank you. Thank you for making it today, ladies and gentlemen, Laurie, Tim, and Srini. Okay, so off to some questions now, and we'll just stick to two and then get back to your presentation. Not all entirely on labor, but I might go back to some of the other questions that came up as well. But how can the supply chain move around freely in the gray zone? Is there such a thing as supply chain diplomacy, given the developing economic coercion of some hostile gray zone activities?
Well, thanks for that question, Lumpy. Absolutely. But this is not necessarily even just a gray zone thing. Companies for decades have worried about concentrations of their supply chains in any one country or set of countries, and so it makes commercial sense and it makes geopolitical sense for there to be an effort to figure out how best you diversify. Now, the fundamental problem that we in the United States or in Europe or wherever have is we don't control those supply chains. Those are controlled by the private sector. How we create incentives for the private sector to diversify in ways that meet geopolitical ends is interesting. But I think the companies aren't dumb. They know what's in their commercial interests, and they will make some of these changes. But some changes may require government action. So thanks very much for that question.
If I can add another sort of non-gray zone point to supply chain. For some years back, there was an earthquake in Taiwan, and it disrupted the manufacturing of the semiconductor chips. Taiwan is one of the largest suppliers of semiconductor chips. And what happened as a result of that is that the production of the computers, in different parts of the world were impacted. And that was a wake-up call to a lot of companies, and they woke up and said, hey, we're not going to be so dependent on one country, for we have to like diversify our chain of, from where we get the stuff. And it could happen in non-gray zone, but gray zone just gives the country that supplies this, political leverage over you.
Back to you, Lumpy.
Yeah, so one more question. It's actually two questions that I'm going to combine because they're actually conflicting with each other from two audience members that are out there. Now we're moving into labor. The first audience member wrote, how can the PRC use labor to coerce other countries? For example, the exporting of Chinese labor to other countries. But at the same time, I have another panelist asks, whether China will get too old, will get too old before it gets rich, is exacerbated by COVID, declining birth rates. Will China actually be the ones accepting immigrant labor? So there's two sides to a coin there. Not sure which one wins out in the end, which one is dominant. So thoughts on that?
So Lumpy, on the first question about how can China affect if they're only using Chinese laborers, well, you mentioned the answer to that one, which is they can affect by denying access to their laborers in other countries. I mean, China is the #2 recipient of remittances after India. So there's a lot of Chinese laborers around the world sending remittances back home. And so they can deny access to that labor. Now, granted, there's some substitutions that could take place, but that's one way that they could do it in terms of affecting the labor market there. The other thing is, the question was about, will China have to accept immigrants at some stage, immigrant labor? Well, I mean, first of all, they could bring back home all of the overseas Chinese first to fill the gaps initially if they wanted to do that. But yeah, the numbers are pretty dramatic. And this all assumes, of course, that growth is going to be based on an economic model like it is today that requires labor in the volumes that it does today. Now, there are other factors that could shift that, but automation, change in the economy to something that's less labor intensive. And so there are factors that could affect it, but chances are that most of the places that are going to face these huge demographic disadvantages are going to have to look at options. And your options, like the Japanese have always faced, is either raise the retirement age, employ more women or other people who are currently underemployed, or automate, robotics or migration. Those are basically your four policy options you've got there.
Right.
And that's my initial response to that.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, that this is an interesting topic and maybe something we can think about a little bit more as we work through the rest of your presentation. And when we get to the end, one of the themes that I've been asking the presenters is, in the gray zone, as we operate in the gray zone, where are the opportunities, for us and our competitors to take advantage of in these things, looking ahead to the future strategically. So something to keep in mind. That's it for the questions right now. We've got a lot more rolling in, which we'll get to at the end. But for now, I turn it back over to you for your next segment. Thank you.
Thank you very much there, Lumpy. And I think this segment's going to be a little bit more about what, sort of the United States and other countries do, and maybe a little less about what China does. So talking about capital, and I wanted to talk a little bit just about global governance systems for the movement of goods and capital, so that we just set the stage for the discussion of geopolitical or geoeconomic tools that's going to follow. And so the post-World War II, the United States, working with a range of other countries, created a number of institutions and agreements and the like that help to manage the global economy. The IMF and the World Bank, the IMF particularly on how to improve macroeconomic stability. Then we've got the WTO, the World Trade Organization, to talk about trade and to set the global rules for trade. Bank for International Settlements, to talk about how the banking system, set norms and operations for the banking system, and something like the International Standards Organization, which helps set standards and non-tariff barriers for different commodities so that we can standardize in ways that support markets. And so these kinds of global norms, global structures have been are what help structure markets.
So I'm going to just riff off of that with just a quick indication of there's a lot of tools in the economic toolkit that can be used to affect other nations and other economies. And some of these are on the tariff side, and some of them are the non-tariff measures. And you can see that there's a lot of different opportunities here that can be deployed either in a positive or a negative sense. These are mostly the negative ones to impact these economies. Now, I'd like to share, one of the more, the next slide is one of the big ones, which is sanctions. And economic sanctions are a big tool in the toolkit. I updated this chart as of March 1st because the sanction regimes keep moving around here. We've got a lot more lists on the regimes listed on here than there was when I first started making this chart a couple of years ago. The other thing you'll notice is a trend away from just national sanctions of a country, but to thematic sanctions. And you'll see some of the big thematic ones on there: counter narcotics, election interference, terrorism, things like that. So these are some trends that this tool is being increasingly deployed as a tool of economic statecraft, as a statement of geopolitical positioning as well, and certainly can be used in the sense of a gray zone tactic. Now, the reason all of this is allowed is because under the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, the GATT, in Article 21, there is the security exception. And that says in Part B there, the big part is that nothing will prevent any contracting party of these economies from taking any action which it considers necessary for the protection of its essential security interests. And the big debate, of course, is about that part, which it considers. If countries can determine their own national security interests, and that sounds logical, but then if they take it to an extreme, it can be used beyond its own national security interests for other means to deny others their interests. So that's the big debate as to whether or not it's, who should decide. The WTO has taken on cases that look at being able to hear grievances about this. So the WTO at least feels that they have some say in determining, whether or not something can be considered a national security interest. Just not everybody agrees with that. So it's an interesting debate that's going on. And with that, I'll turn it over to Srini.
All right, let me give you a very quick example, right? The very quick example, just a very recent example, just from last week, building on what Dr. Foreman just said. What China did, suddenly it said it imports large quantities. I forget the exact volume of kilotons it imports over the course of the year from pineapples from Taiwan, right? And suddenly, just before the shipment was to be delivered, it said, you know what? I don't want your pineapples. There are some pests in them, right? This is not a way to telegraph if you genuinely feel there are pests or some kind of insects or some kind of intrusion into your supply chain. You communicated well ahead of time. There's meetings and there's process to go through if you're going to put up this NTBs or non-tariff barriers. But the way this was done is to send a message to look, hey, if you're going to do something else in another area, I am going to punish you in a different area, in the trade area. And if you look at that a little bit closely, what it also tells us is that the claim was, oh, I'm doing it for national security reasons. I'm doing it for the security and concern for my people. You can't really question that. But the message was very clear. Well, eventually, the pineapple was bought by other countries, including some of the regional partners, and the Taiwanese actually, purchased most of the pineapples and they consumed it. But the point really is, how states deploy this GATT rule that Dr. Forman talked about. I'll give you another example, right? Two, freight liners, freight ships that were delivering goods, MV Anastasia and MV Jug Anand, they were en route to a port in China, to offload some iron ore from Australia. So India had a dispute, as you know, with the PRC on the border, and Australia had made a claim that it was going to support a WHO investigation into the origins of COVID. And Australia also banned Chinese money being put into Australian parliamentarians, and they made public statements on it, and China was obviously upset. So what it did, it blocked the offloading of the goods in some of those Australian iron ore, Australian coal. They made the people who are servicing the ships were largely Indian freightliner workers, and they couldn't see their families. They were stuck there for 4 months, and the goods were eventually let in 4 or 5 months. But the messaging was very clear that we are going to punish you if you're going to do these sorts of things that affect the core interest of our country. Again, national security was, as Dr. Forman pointed out, was the reason behind it, but the way it was executed was very different. Thank you.
Thank you. So I want to talk about sort of another part of capital, and this is development assistance or economic assistance that countries often offer. And one of the great examples of that for the United States was the Marshall Plan after World War II. And why do we do this? We do this to make friends and influence people. So exactly the topic that we've been talking about in Gray Zone. So this is a bit of the obvious, but so today though, we have USAID and most recently the Development Finance Corporation, which is a new arm of the US government to promote to make loans for projects around the world. But we're not the only people in this space. There's JICA, and China's got a development agency. And so everyone's working this, everybody does. I just picked those two. And then we have the multilateral agencies. So the World Bank, the ADB, there's a number of different ways in which globally we're trying to influence populations through the provision of economic assistance of one flavor or another. Then if we looked at another issue of capital flows, this has to do with foreign direct investment. And so one of the ways in which we regulate that is through bilateral investment treaties. And that map that you see there, the darker the color, the more investment treaties you have. And you can see the United States has some, but Russia, China, some other countries have more. And these treaties regulate how we settle disputes and how the rules are set for investments around the world. There's a whole long story on BITs, but we're not going to go into that because we don't have time. But then also internally, when within countries, you regulate who can invest. And so in the United States, we have something called the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States that determines whether or not a specific investment violates national security in some way. And then when things go wrong, you might have to go to arbitration, and that's the ICSID and some other organizations. But the one thing I wanted to say is one of the things when we talk about capital, and one of the differences in the sort of the current situation is there are a lot of state-owned enterprises and sovereign wealth funds out there in the world that are providing capital for projects and programs. States can have a lot of influence over how those funds are made available. In the United States and other countries, we don't have those. We have things called venture capital funds, or we have banks, or we have we have foreign direct investors who mobilize capital. That's a lot more difficult for us to point in one direction and say, hey, go build that thing or go invest there. And so that's a challenge, and how we address that within this whole gray zone economics is going to be an important issue. And with that, we're done with our presentation on the capital side. Over to you, Lumpy.
Okay, great. Thank you all. Appreciate it. So a few questions. We'll ask a couple and then we'll get to the rest at the end. One of the people in the audience said, a day one presenter, and I'm pretty sure it was Raquel, said that it's time that we reconsider industrial policy in the West, implying a need for a more centralized and disciplined coordination of Western public-private economic activities as a response to centralized authoritarian competitors. Do you agree with that?
So I'd say a couple of things. One, we've never given up on industrial policy. We just called it something else. We make investments in infrastructure. We make lots of decisions that have an impact on where industries go the government spends money to do certain things, that has an impact. So we never gave it up, but entirely, even though we may said we had. But the other thing is, and I think this is a norms and value thing that we've got to just decide. Do we believe that, you know, giving the private sector a relatively free rein creates the greatest opportunity for us in the long run, or not? We may have to move the pendulum a little bit on industrial policy. Maybe it's gone a little bit too far towards, you know, just letting the private sector do what it wants and not having much direction from the government. But I think that, you know, we've got to find the place on that pendulum, and we have to figure out what we stand for and how we want to organize our society. And that's, you know, I think we don't just buy into what we think our competitors are doing because they happen to be succeeding today. Whether they will succeed tomorrow is another question. Does anybody else want to say anything?
No,
Yeah.
Thank
Sorry,
you.
I'd like to make a comment on that one. Just something a little bit more provocative, and this is in line with some of the discussion we had on day one as well. You know, so throughout this workshop, and you know, I'm sure elsewhere, some people have suggested that, you know, if we truly want to compete, if we truly want to win the competition, right? Because if it's a competition, it implies that somebody wins or loses, right? Are we doing enough as far as you mentioned our values, right? And of course, there are core values and fundamentals of a democracy that we will not compromise on. But you know, I'm asking you to be a little bit provocative, the three of you in the room. Are there things that we need to adjust? You know, I'm asking you, go out on a limb. Are there things that we need to assume some more risk on based on, you know, and I go back to Raquel's comments on day one that, you know, a lot of our functioning regulations, laws, international standards and norms are built on an era that's long past. What do we need to change in order to truly compete?
So I'm just going to say one opening thing, Lumpy, and maybe it's not provocative enough, but the thing about economics, and you've seen this in my lectures, is it's not just an area of competition. It's also usually rated as the greatest area for cooperation too. So it's a tool that goes both ways, and it's one that so you can take it if you want to turn it into just a competitive tool. You can do that, but then you're really going to cut off your nose to spite your face, because there's so many, trade itself, you know, is built on cooperation. These supply chains are built on cooperation. A lot of this, and going back to sort of an autocratic type of, autarkic type of system where we're, you know, solely, just taking care of ourselves, just isn't the future. That, I mean, it wasn't the present, let alone the future. So that's my comment on it. Tim?
No, I totally agree. I mean, I think that there's something to be said. I do believe, well, a couple of things. I think that the countries that believe in the norms and rules of the international system and believe that there should be competition need to come together. And maybe one of the things that we've fallen down on is antitrust, as an example. We have, you know, for us, we strongly believe that competition is important. Cooperation is fine up to a certain limit. If it's companies, then they violate our antitrust laws. But you know, finding ways to ensure that everyone globally is playing by the same rules is critically important. And I think that's where we don't really have to change. I mean, yes, we do have to revisit the rules. We have to look, and you know, sort of things have changed. It's a very different world than it was 50 years ago, 20 years ago. But I think some of the fundamental approaches can stay the same. We just need to enforce them, and we need to get our partners and the other countries that feel similarly to come around and do that. So that's my provocative bit.
Okay, I'm going to combine two other questions here into one, and then it involves China's weaponizing of digital currency and also the Belt and Road. So I know those are two different things. There's overlap, but you know, do we do you have any examples, or do you believe that Belt and Road and digital currencies are being, well, I think the answer is obvious, but are they being weaponized for strategic objectives?
I'll take the Belt and Road. On the Belt and Road, one of the examples that I can give is from South Asia, right? And if you look at the China-Pakistan economic corridor, I don't know if I would call it weaponizing, but definitely the footprint of one particular country is pretty heavy. And then now the dependency relationship between, say, Pakistan and China is increasingly very heavy, and it favors PRC significantly, right? And that is also happening to a certain extent in Maldives. It is also happening a lot in Sri Lanka, more so in Sri Lanka, and Myanmar, obviously. Right? You're seeing that Bangladesh is sort of in the middle, and Nepal also pretty high. So what it does is that these, you can call them debt trap diplomacy, you can call them BRI, however we choose to call them. What it reduces. See, here's the point. The point is that dependency in which one country can negatively influence another country's foreign policy. Say, suppose I have a lot of loans with World Bank, and World Bank, is a different kind of animal than, say, if I have a lot of loans, say, that I owe to Switzerland. So that, there's definitely an aspect of, you can use it for political manipulation.
Let me just say one thing about very quickly about Belt and Road and about debt. The last time I was thinking about this or whatever, last time I remember was there was a Latin America debt problem. That wasn't Chinese debt. That was debt to American banks, American firms. The fact that countries go out there and countries, whatever, go out and make loans for things and try to make friends and influence people. We've been doing that all the time. So are we really complaining about China doing what we did better than we're doing? I'm not quite sure. But I think we need to look at this rationally. And the fundamental question for me on the Belt and Road comes down to what happens when these debts go sour, which they're going to do. If there are Paris Club renegotiations, then it's just like everything else. If China tries to do something, then we've got to work about that out through the G8 or through other mechanisms. Cryptocurrencies, just very, very briefly. Everybody's working on cryptocurrencies, or not cryptocurrencies, but digital currencies. Yes, there's going to be a shift towards the greater use of these digital currencies. I haven't seen it very much lately. We'll see how it goes. We've got a whole set of lectures for another course that we're doing on this. But I think that it's just part of the effort that's going on that's going to mean that the Chinese currency is going to play a bigger role in the economy. And I'm not sure whether it's digital or not. This is just going to happen. So that's it, Lumpy. Over to you.
Okay, great. Okay, back over to you all. Thank you.
Thank you. So enterprise. So I just wanted to talk about some things, and this is just about sort of how do we sort of have an effect or impact upon other economies. Well, one thing is we encourage FDI, and one of the ways in which we try to bring countries into the world economy is by having our companies go out and make investments there and bringing them in that way. And one of the ways in which countries try to encourage other companies to come and invest in them is to prove that they have a positive business enabling environment. And the World Bank doing business rankings was an example of that. So I just throw that out there. I think we need to get going on time, so I'm not going to spend much time on this. But then we have the flip side of that. How do we use technology, or how do we, at the enterprise level, try to use geoeconomic tools? And one thing that the United States has been doing recently is restricting access to technology. So we'll identify companies that we are worried about. Let's call it Huawei, as an example. And we'll say, you can't have patents, you can't have access to chips. And that can have a dramatic impact. So that's one of the tools that we have. But I wanted to come back to this, and this goes to the sanctions point from earlier. And I saw one question in the chat about, well, sanctions just don't work. What's going on here? Well, one of the issues with any kind of sanction, any kind of denial, is that, what do people do? They make choices. They react to those. So what's China doing in reaction to cutting Huawei off from chips? They're making their own chips. And this is one of the things that we've got to worry about. Anytime you're using an economic tool, it doesn't just, it's not like throwing a switch, or maybe throwing a switch for the first year, but the next year, 2 years, 5 years, you have to think about how people respond to that. What kind of changes in the market does it create? And are those kinds of changes in the market that you want to create? And so with that, I'm going to pass it over to Srini.
A slightly different kind of example, right? So again, on the India-China dimension, there's a lot going on there, right? There's a lot of tensions in there, all driven by the territorial conflict largely. Recently, both countries agreed to a ceasefire, and they kind of, pulled back their troops from the disputed borderline. So right at the time a news story appeared, and this is from New York Times, and you can see it on the screen, China appears to warn India, push hard and your lights could go out, right? This is sort of, I can attack your enterprise. This would fall more under the cyber category, which you've been all discussing. And I don't think this is a cyber warfare or cyber hacking. This is to say, I have the ability to disrupt your power grid. I have the ability to shut down your power grid. I have more power than you. So please do not make me do this. If you do, you can already see this. So this is just another negative example, not necessarily a positive example, not cryptocurrency or BRI, but the ability to penetrate a country's power network and disrupt them is quite a significant message of gray zone tactic. And that's really the big point I wanted to make on this one.
Thanks, Srini. And with that, we have one more.
Currency manipulation. This is more, you saw that the United States Treasury Department designated China as a currency manipulator, right? This is another way you can keep your exports cheaper and imports more expensive by artificially keeping your currencies, at a market at a lower level, or buying and selling currencies in the foreign exchange market and intervening in the foreign exchange market in a significant way to make it really cheap. That's another example, right? Large countries can afford to do these sorts of things. Smaller countries cannot do it. They cannot affect the prices of the currency in any significant way like this. And that is another way of, ability to influence, influencing a trade by doing monetary tactics. So.
And with that, I believe we are back. We are down here to the end of our presentation. We've been talking about how different policies can interfere or promote economic growth. A lot of the discussion within the gray zone is about how you hurt your opponents, but there's a lot that goes on in the gray zone that's about making friends and influencing people. So there's also the positive side, and I think we need to look at both of that, because you can use foreign assistance, you can use investment. We use lots of different tools for positive purposes in the gray zone. And so as we think about our tools and think about how they're applied, I think we need to think about both sides. And so, at the end, what we believe is that there's a wide variety of economic means to influence populations and affect legitimacy, both positively and negatively. And we've been doing them for decades. China's doing them, Japan does it, Canada does it, Mexico, all of our friends, everybody does it. And so, and this is particularly true in the area of economics. In economics, as Laurie was saying, every day we compete and we cooperate. And I think this is a great area to think about in terms of gray zone, planning or thought that, it's both sides. You've got to play both sides of that coin. And with that, Lumpy, I'm going to pass, unless anybody else wants to say anything, I'm going to pass it over to you for further comments and questions from the crowd.
Okay, we've got plenty of comments and questions, but Srini, do you have any other thoughts, or Laurie?
Just one very quick point. So what India is doing, like in the positive point, vaccine diplomacy, right? That's, positive side. That's it.
Okay, great. So I'm gonna bounce around between your four sections there to leave a little variety in the discussion here today. This back to your initial segment on land. Srini, one of you mentioned rare earth minerals, and the question is, it gets to vulnerability for us. I mean, the question is us as Americans, but you can think of our foreign friends, partners, and allies in this equation too. But how dependent are we on rare earth minerals? Are we in dire straits, or are there alternative sources? So basically, is this an area where we are susceptible to being negatively influenced, or are there options out there?
One, yes, it is something that's of concern. Two, we do need to remember that we, the United States, used to own the rare earth market before we decided that it was too dirty and environmentally polluting, that we didn't want to do all that processing within country. So there are trade-offs here. There were decisions that were made a number of years ago about how we were going to, how the supply chain worked. And back then, we decided that we didn't want to have all that pollution. And so we would, do something that we might not think was a good thing. You could think was one, strategically questionable, and two, maybe morally questionable. But we do need to think about how we deal with this. And there's a lot going on where the U.S. government's trying to promote the development of some processing of these rare earths in the United States. And one of the things to remember, and in other countries, I mean, some of this stuff comes from Africa, it comes from all over the place. And as one of our colleagues always points out, remember, rare earths are not rare. They're everywhere, and you can get them lots. What makes them rare is generally processing is difficult and polluting. And so how you have to be committed to doing this and figure out how you solve these problems. So if we do a big push to try to improve the environmental impacts of these processing processes, if we invest in it, that could be one thing. It's also recycling. How do we recycle all the stuff that we've got? So there's lots of different opportunities out there, and we just have to get the economic incentives correct. The economic incentives have been wrong for a while, or not wrong, but have been set with a certain set of norms and beliefs. If the strategic calculation means that it needs to go a little bit differently, then we have to figure out how we solve that problem.
On the rare earths, what is interesting is China's got a stranglehold even on the market, like in Democratic Republic of Congo, largest deposits of rare earths are found, artisan mining going on, and they have all the supply networks operating, and then the American companies for different human rights and labor and international laws and order decided not to go into certain regions of the world to extract it. But the Chinese investors are willing to go into those areas. So it's just not China making and selling, but they're also going into foreign markets and extracting it. That's one. And number two, Tim talked about recycling, and I want to mention that some of the largest recycling of these rare earths and other materials, copper, is being done in countries like Bangladesh and India. There's a lot of these stripping and of the copper wires and all this stuff happening. It's dirty, highly toxic industries, and we have to keep in mind. And so there's the negative consequence involved in that.
Okay. All right. Getting to capital. So what should be the U.S. measures in responding to any kind of coercive action that we've seen on China or others regarding coercive action with capital, whether that's, the things we talked about, digital currencies, Belt and Road, debt diplomacy, is it possible for the United States to lead the establishment? Doesn't have to be the United States, but that's just what the question says. But, sort of a global, NATO's not the good example because that's a military alliance, but, and think NATO like, just to visualize something, an economic alliance in which liberal domestic countries, retaliate against economic coercion. And if so, what would be the security implications of that? So there you go. Over to you.
Well, we do have something like that, Lumpy. It's called the WTO. And so to the extent that any of these actions are undertaken and they are outside of the boundaries, that are captured in the agreements of the WTO, then that is the body to go to adjudicate these things. Now that, is the WTO the right institution for the times? It's what we've got, and the thing I would argue is strengthening that and the dispute settlement mechanism, and use that as the first line of action. But
specifically on this issue of debt diplomacy, first, there's lots of noise on this, but I'm not quite sure that we've seen a lot of examples of where where China, whatever other countries take advantage of debt. The world has a long history of doing workouts for countries that get in trouble. We know how this works. There's this thing called the Paris Club that meets and resolves debts for countries that get in trouble. So we, as the countries who are part of the Paris Club, and China has not been traditionally part of the Paris Club, because it hasn't been a debtor, a lender for that long. Need to come together and sort of start studying, well, I shouldn't say start, continue applying rules that have, that were worked out with the Latin American debt crisis, the Southeast Asian debt crisis. I mean, there have been debt crises around the world time and again where sovereign debt goes sour. And we just need to, sort of come up with this. And we started at the beginning of the COVID response, I believe it was the G20 that came up with some, some provisions about, sort of debt moratorium and the like. And so finding ways to bring China into that, or I shouldn't just say China, all countries who are making loans into those processes so that countries that get in trouble have a resolution. Because the fundamental thing, remember, countries are sovereign. If one country makes a loan to another country and they stop paying, well, what can you do? You can maybe, put trade sanctions on or try to do financial sanctions, but they're sovereign. You can't take them to court. You can't, their own courts or whatever. It doesn't work. So you got to these mechanisms need to be fleshed out. So thanks for the question, Alfie.
Okay. Question on sanctions, since it's come up quite a bit. This audience member said that historically, sanctions are questionable, if not, just generally don't work at all. Not had much of an impact on a country's stance. Do you think that they're still useful, or does it actually, can they be counterproductive? Thoughts on that?
So the statistics on sanctions, being generous and counting success, is about a third. About a third of the times they succeed in achieving at least one of the goals that is stated in the sanction of a behavior that is that they're trying to change. So it's not the highest batting average out there in terms of the success rate on the sanctions. However, they serve other purposes. I mean, they do serve purposes of sending signals, and both internationally, but also domestically, sending signals to your domestic constituency that you're taking a stand against something. And it would be nice if they work completely, or if just the threat of a sanction was enough to make a difference. But I think the key is to look at not how often do they work, but when do they work, and looking at why those sanctions work better than other ones, and designing better sanctions rather than just a knee-jerk reaction to, this country bad, let's sanction them, but looking more strategically and more smartly at designing a sanction that will have a better impact. And that takes a lot of work, but I think that is probably the option. I mean, other options are either just talking or shooting. And this is sort of in between, and it's what we've got. So I would just argue for making them better rather than abandoning them altogether.
Just to give you two examples, right? Two countries that are in the sanctions radar is Iran, right? The People's Republic, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and the Democratic Republic of Korea. If you look at those countries, they managed to evade sanctions. It's not a gasket that completely blocks all the air out, all the air from coming in or going out, right? It's not total, but it's sufficiently disruptive so that these countries cannot do a lot of things that they would like to do, right? And that puts enormous pressure on the leadership of those countries. I think that is entirely the purpose of these sanctions, is to be disruptive enough to make them rethink. The fact that they don't do it in every instance is not exactly a smack at it, but it, as Dr. Foreman pointed out, it's still an effective tool enough to put a lot of pressure on these countries.
Okay. All right. Here's a question on ethics. Can you educate us at all on ethics, or some sort of global governance, ethical global governance measures that are in place to curtail the possibility of an economically powerful nation using negative economic tools to affect another weak country for political gains, which would affect the population of that weaker state?
I'm going to relate this in a certain narrow aspect to another question that was in the chat about non-tariff measures. 80–90% of all world trade is subjected to non-tariff measures, and these measures reflect values and ethics and standards that people hold. And just because it's called non-tariff measure doesn't mean it's a bad thing. Many non-tariff measures are good things. Phytosanitary restrictions. You want the food that's imported to your country to not be diseased or something like that. So they're fine. They're only a bad thing, these non-tariff measures, when they go outside of a bound, some bounds, some agreed upon bounds, like it's not based in science or something like that for the phytosanitary ones. So there are all kinds of ways with those measures. And non-tariff measures include intellectual property and rules of origin and export measures and licensing, government procurement, all kinds of things. So I think those are ways by which we on a daily basis reflect values. We don't want to admit a product that was made with child labor or from the diamond mines or the rough diamond trade and things like that. So I think there are ways that we can express it. There's not one single way to do that, but there are ways every day that economies can express their values and their ethics through those sorts of measures. And that's what I'll add to that discussion.
So I now would just sort of add to that. There's a couple of things. What Laurie is describing is the WTO agreements. The WTO agreements try to rationalize that and put in place rules that would keep countries from doing things arbitrarily to other countries. And so through the WTO dispute settlement process, countries have an opportunity to do that. One of the challenges is the dispute settlement process is incredibly expensive and incredibly difficult. So one way in which the developed countries of the world could help out the less developed countries is set up a fund or a mechanism to help them do their cases. Now, developed countries might not want to do that because they're often the ones that, do the bad thing to the developing countries, but let's set that aside. That's one possibility. The other thing that's going on, it's very difficult to get countries to agree to a set of rules about standards and how you treat things and, the products and all of that. It's a lot easier for communities to decide what kinds of behaviors are going to be okay or not. So here in the United States, you see this sort of, free trade coffee as an example. That's not a global standard of any, people are trying to create a global standard on that, but it's not a government endorsed standard. It's people saying, no, I will not consume a product that doesn't meet certain standards. And you see, some big companies like Starbucks and Walmart and Amazon, developing some standards like that because they find it to be in their commercial interest. So I think that that's another way in which these kinds of moral and ethical issues can be sort of brought to the fore in the market. People, consumers need to care about it, and if consumers don't care about it, then it won't go. But if people do, then it can. There are mechanisms by which these kinds of standards can be put into place on the market.
Okay. All right. Re- Strategic emerging technologies. How do we manufacture within those technologies to ensure that we can gain and maintain leadership or an advantage, I would say, in those sectors? We need to be clear in what we mean by industry, not a retention of coal, but instead, a look ahead.
Yes.
Yeah, no disagreement.
But I do think, but in the heart of that question it goes back to Laurie's sort of autarky issue. We have to recognize that we can't make everything ourselves. That's never going, that in this current day and age, that's not going to be the way this works. We have to find the partners that we want to cooperate with, find ways to collectively do things that are, sort of in the global best, our view of the global best interest, and do that. And I do think, and this could involve China. I mean, what we have to, yes, there's a strategic competition going on with China. I'm not going to try to be a denialist on that. But I think that, we have to ultimately be looking 20, 30, 40, 50 years out at a world where we're all cooperating in some way. And how we do that is going to be important. And I think part of that is diversification. Part of the mistake that we've made globally over the last 30 years is allowing China to become the manufacturer of the world.
Mm-hmm.
And when we did that, we gave China the ability to stop, to control that manufacturing. And I think what we're going to see over the next, several decades is the reversal of that. China is going to not be the manufacturer of the world. Technologies like additive manufacturing and other sort of new technologies are going to mean that manufacturing that used to have to go on in one place no longer does. And I think, we're going to see that. And that's the way the world resolves this problem ultimately. Because remember, and I come back to this a lot with my colleagues here. Remember back in the 1980s, we all believed that we were going to be speaking Japanese right now, that the Japanese were going to have taken over the world. And I saw an interesting graphic from the Visual Capitalists where they show how, the world's economies have changed as a percentage of the US economy over the years. And if you look in the 70s and the 80s, the Japanese are just coming right up against us and they're about ready to take over. And then all of a sudden it went back down. And now you see China doing the same thing. And so how that is going to play out is important. But, remember, your competitor today may be your cooperating partner tomorrow.
Okay. So here's a question, if you think of the economic domain, is there any other particular domain, and I guess whatever comes to mind, as you think of other domains that are out there, whatever, space,
Economics is everything, Lumpy.
cyber, environmental. I know everything has some overlap with the economic domain, but is there any particular domain that comes to mind that works particularly well in influencing a target state's public opinion and policy decision making? So this gets to the heart of really what, going back to the main principle of the workshop this week, this gray zone idea of influencing populations and affecting legitimacy. Yes, everything is interlocked with economics, but is there any particular area that you think might be, more influential than another?
This is my time to be provocative, right? Artificial intelligence is going to be the next big thing. Like China is already trying to get on that train, and it is trying to use it to become a peer competitor or outcompete the United States. All right, so it's one of those things. It's like a virus in many ways, right? The human developed virus, in the sense that I say it in a positive way, because it's going to permeate all economic, business, trading, intellectual property rights, contracts, blockchains, cryptocurrencies, Internet of Things. It's going to permeate all of that. And it's all going to sit in the cloud and sort of work in the background. You're not going to see this AI is not like a machine, it's not a black box. And that's where, and it's going to make a lot of autonomous decision making, and that's where it is going: autonomous decision making, autonomous weapons, robotics, and that's where you're going to see the next major technological, economical, and socio-structural impact coming in. Just, it's not me, it's Elon Musk, it's Sundar Pichai from Google, Bill Gates. These visionary leaders are saying this, and including several governments, including the Pope. He has just issued a call for AI ethics. The Rome call just came out, and he's renewed the call this year again.
I'm going to go on a completely
I'm sorry,
opposite-
can I make a comment on that before we go over to Laurie? So, Srini, as you mentioned AI, the thing that makes AI successful is data. We've all heard that. That's the new gold, or that's the new oil, is data.
Right.
As AI becomes more prominent, and we are looking to compete or cooperate, it's all about the data. Can we keep up with our competitors as far as that feeds our AI, or we tend to hear that we're behind the power curve on this one?
You're right, Lumpy. You raise a very good point. With China's, unfortunately, I have to keep bringing in China here, or fortunately, because they have this 1.4 million pieces of data available. They're able to train some of their AI systems a lot more effectively and quickly. The smart cities, the smart ports, a lot of stuff they're doing, the surveillance capitalism, the digital authoritarianism, all the stuff they're doing, the disruptive stuff, cyber hacking, information warfare. Russia is doing a lot of that too. They're able to do that. But the problem, I think, they're going to run into, there's going to be limits to the diversity of their data. So if you look at the rest of the 192 other countries, depending on how we count them, the diversity, not just in how people look, but also in terms of the varieties of behaviors and economic, that they lack at now. And that's why they want to build this 5G, where they can tap into those data networks and extract those data points too. And that's, that's the scary part. And I think that's more dangerous part, or at least I think. And that's what Europe and the Pope and other countries are big on. OECD in general is big on data privacy.
Okay, Laurie?
I'm going to go in a completely different direction. And I don't know if this is a domain per se, but I'll say an area of good overlap. And that's because I come from farmland. I'm going to say food security. Because the economics of food, if you wanted to see some panic within a certain major competitive country in the last year or so, it was the tripling of the price of pork, when all of a sudden there was a shortage of pork, and having to tap the strategic pork reserves, because without that, there could have been some internal instability. Because when people put up with a lot until they get hungry, and then they kind of tend to go to the streets and things like that. So I'm going to look back, and I'm going to link economics with agriculture, with food security, and that would be my field that I would take a look at.
Okay.
Well, I just wanted to say that I would just add or say I totally agree with Laurie. I think food security, and particularly how food value chains work, is critical. But I think the other issue is I don't want to say disinformation, but the messaging that gets placed out there. I think that one of the challenges that the U.S. in particular has had is that we don't message very well about our successes, and we don't message very well, we don't tell our stories very well. And so whatever we do on food security, whatever gets done on AI, whatever gets done in economics, we need collectively to figure out how to better message that internally and to the rest of the world. Okay.
All right. We are down to our final 7 minutes with the three of you. It's been a pleasure, and I know the audience has enjoyed it. What I'll do is, I have some more questions, but what I'd rather do is just turn the mic over to you three. If you could even each take a minute or two at the most, because we're short on time. But if you have any closing thoughts that you'd like to share with the audience out there, we've got quite a turnout again here today. So over to you. in whatever order. Tim, yeah, I see you there first, so I'll turn.
I was leaning off to Laura. I was giving Lori the first shot here,
Okay, all right, off to
or
Lori.
she should take the
No,
first
no,
shot.
oh, great. Okay, all right. Well, off
Sorry
the
about
top
that.
of my head, first of all, I want to thank all of you for putting up with our muffled voices. As Lumpy noted, we had to scramble to reset and to borrow our colleague Sherry Lynn's laptop that was actually still connected to government Zoom and didn't lose its connection. So thank you to Sherry Lynn, and thank you to all of you. I'm going to keep these questions that are in the chat because there's some really good questions there. And I really appreciate you, Lumpy, for adding economics in here as a topic. I think, as we said at the beginning, my closing thought is that we exercise economic tools both in a carrot and a stick, in a reward and a punishment way every single day. And we do it at individual levels, in every transaction we make. And so this is like the core of influence operations I think is through all of us being economic persons and the way we operate. And as you think about every transaction you make, think about that, about what messages you're sending and how that impacts other people, just even as a daily consumer. So that's what I'll start off with, and I'll hand it over to Srini.
Let me just, I'm thinking here more on the, more on a scale here. So for example, if you think of the strategy of winning hearts and minds, right? You go into a country, you dig wells, build bridges, girls' schools, and all that. With AI and the internet, you can just go in and say, "I'll build the internet backbone for you. I will put television sets in your country, and we will give you programming." I think those sort of things, the AI-driven stuff that China's now doing with the smart cities. And smart ports, and with this 5G, they're also putting in the internet backbone, ICT, the undersea cables, so they can create their own data channels. That I think is going to be pivotal. The way they're winning hearts and minds. It's not this traditional strategy of building. I don't want to call it all the conventional way of doing it. They're not doing it that way. They're coming in and they're doing different stuff, and they're leveraging it both ways, both for their benefit and potentially also the benefit of the country in which they're doing these investment activities. So that's sort of the closing point I want to raise.
Okay, Tim.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Lumpy, and I would just reiterate Laurie's thanks to Sherry Lynn out there, who's graciously given us her office, and to the audience of this for all the great questions. And we look forward, we've, as Laurie said, we're saving the chat and we're going to look through it some more because I think that's really useful. I also just wanted to say, we focus so much in this gray zone stuff on competition. Let's remember that it's also cooperation, and cooperation, not just with our allies, but with the people who we want to be our allies at some point in the future. We should be finding ways where we can to cooperate. And the other just factor, and I've mentioned this once before, is just remember, whatever you're doing in the gray zone, particularly if we're talking about economics and where decisions are being made by a diverse group of people, think about the second order effects. You make one change, you do one sanction, you take some action against someone. It will, people will then react, and they will adjust their behavior in some way, which may not be what you wanted. They may find ways around what you were trying to influence. And so we always have to think very carefully about the tools that we use and how we use them. And remember that in the end, we're competing and cooperating with everybody, with every other country in the world every day, particularly in the economics field. So thanks very much.
Okay, great. Dr. Laurie Foreman, Dr. Tim Burer, and Dr. Srini Sitaraman, thank you very much to the three of you. It's been a pleasure having you here today. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of day 3. Just a summary, if I could recap, we started off 3 days ago in the military domain, at our OSD level, talked a little bit about special operations. Then we started getting away from that. We started talking about information, economics, human security cooperation, big data, you name it, but all these other factors that feed into under the umbrella of gray zone, right? It's definitely not a military thing. In fact, the military or defense, as you can tell from all these discussions over the past week, we are really just more of a supporting actor on the stage of competition when it comes to, you know, the activities below conflict. Tomorrow, however, we will kind of bring it back in a circle, and we will get back to the defense side of the house as we wrap up the workshop. So we welcome you to join us again tomorrow. We will start off with Indo-Pacific Command. How they envision and think about competition. We'll then hear from Special Operations Command Pacific, and then we'll also hear from another combatant command. There's actually two that we're going to hear from tomorrow: Indo-PACOM and Special Operations Command itself in Tampa, Florida, on some thoughts on competition and perhaps some improvements we need to make in the way we think about irregular warfare, gray zone conflict, hybrid conflict. So we're gonna close that loop again tomorrow. So ladies and gentlemen, thank you again so much for joining us here today. Sorry for the technical glitches that we had, and we will see you tomorrow at the same time. Aloha.